He was ordered to attack, but instead the German shepherd froze, then stepped in front of the man he was trained to take down. "I know those eyes," the dog seemed to say. "I never forgot you." Why would a police dog defy his handler to protect a stranger in handcuffs? On a rainy night, a routine arrest spiraled into something no one expected, a storm of loyalty, memory, and a bond that refused to be erased. Could a stolen past still live in a dog's heart after 6 long years? This is the story of love remembered, justice reclaimed, and a dog who never gave up. Let's dive into it. The rain had come without warning, heavy, relentless, cold enough to slip through even the thickest police-issued jacket. It fell in silver sheets against the windshield of Officer Raymond Clark's cruiser, smearing the world outside into a watery blur. The dashboard pulsed with the low red glow of emergency lights. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled like a promise not yet kept. Clark's knuckles were white around the steering wheel. His jaw was tight, his focus unshakable. Ashford Springs was a sleepy town most nights, but tonight, something had stirred. The call came in just after midnight. Silent alarm triggered at the old Ashford market. No witnesses, no backup yet. Just him and the dog. Leo sat beside him in the passenger seat, perfectly still. Rain tapped against the window near his face, but the German shepherd didn't flinch. His ears stood tall, his eyes sharp and locked ahead, the faint reflection of street lamps flickering in his gaze. In 6 years on the force, Clark had never seen a dog more focused, more loyal. Leo wasn't just a tool of the department. He was a legend, a machine in a fur coat. Flawless. Until tonight. The cruiser slid to a stop behind the market, tires hissing on slick pavement. The alleyway was narrow, drowning in shadows and steam. The sirens died, replaced by the sound of rain and Clark's own heartbeat pounding in his ears. Movement. A dark figure bolted from the rear of the building, feet splashing through puddles, breath visible in the cold air. Instinct kicked in. "Visual!" Clark called out, already throwing the door open. Leo sprang from the car with practiced grace, claws scraping on the wet concrete. Man and dog moved in tandem, their rhythm one and the same, an unspoken ballet honed through repetition and trust. They chased the suspect down a narrow lane, around the rusted side of an abandoned diner, until he reached a dead end. Nowhere to run. The man turned, hands raised, chest heaving. Mid-30s maybe, soaked to the bone, not armed, not fighting, just trembling. Clark drew his weapon, kept it low. His voice came steady, trained, commanding. "Leo, attack!" A pause. The rain kept falling, and Leo didn't move. Not an inch. Clark blinked. "Leo, move!" Still nothing. Then the dog shifted, just slightly. One ear twitched, his tail slowly lowered, his body relaxed, almost imperceptibly. He stepped back, looked at Clark, then at the man, then back again, confused, unsure. The man took a shallow breath, eyes wide with disbelief. Then, softly, so softly it almost vanished beneath the rainfall, he spoke a name. "Leo?" It wasn't a command. It wasn't fear. It was something older, deeper. Recognition. Leo's body stiffened, then melted. His ears flattened. His tail flicked once in a slow, uncertain wag. And then, from the depths of his throat, came a sound Clark had never heard from him before. A whimper. Low. fragile, human. Clark's breath caught in his throat. "What did you just say?" he asked, stepping closer. But the man didn't answer. He didn't move. His eyes were locked on Leo, wide and wet with something not even fear could explain. Emotion. Clark felt a weight settle in his chest. Heavy. Unfamiliar. The German Shepherd, the department's top canine, the dog who never questioned a command, now stood frozen, looking not at a suspect, but at a ghost from a life that no longer existed. The world seemed to pause with him. And in that alleyway soaked in silence and rain, Officer Raymond Clark realized something he never thought he'd have to question. Maybe this wasn't a criminal. Maybe this wasn't even a break-in. Maybe this was a reunion. Rainwater dripped from Officer Raymond Clark's sleeves as he stood in that narrow alley, breathing slower now, as if his lungs were trying to keep up with a heart that had suddenly forgotten how to beat on command. The suspect still hadn't moved. Neither had Leo. Clark lowered his weapon, half because protocol told him to, and half because something inside him said he should. His voice was no longer firm, no longer sharp with authority. It came out quiet. Distant. "Leo," he called again, as if the name might bring the dog back into line. But Leo didn't so much as glance at him. Instead, the dog took one cautious step toward the suspect, then another. The same man Clark had been ready to cuff just moments ago now stood as still as a tombstone. He didn't reach out. He didn't flinch. And when Leo reached him, the shepherd simply sat. Not like a canine awaiting a new order, like a dog who had found something he had been searching for across an unspoken stretch of time. Clark's grip loosened on the pistol. The storm around them seemed to fade into the background. All he could hear was the faint, rhythmic pat of water pooling in gutters and the strange sound of Leo's breath, soft and slow and content. Clark reached for his radio. "Unit 217 requesting backup. Suspect in custody, but I need transport, now." He didn't say why. He couldn't. He didn't have the language for it yet. The precinct was quieter than usual when they arrived. Most of the night shift was still out on call. Clark walked the suspect, wet, silent, eyes vacant, through the rear doors. Leo followed closely, not at Clark's heel, but beside the man. It didn't go unnoticed. A young officer at the desk gave a confused glance. "Why's the canine not restrained?" Clark said nothing. He didn't have an answer that made sense yet. Julian Hayes. That was the name on the suspect's ID. No priors, no warrant, just a soaked man with tired eyes and a dog who wouldn't leave his side. Clark processed the intake by the book. Fingerprints, temporary holding cell, Miranda rights, the quiet paperwork of suspicion. But none of it felt right. Every box he checked only made the knot in his chest tighten. Leo didn't return to the kennel, didn't return to his cot. He sat, planted, just outside Julian's cell, unmoving, watching. Not like a guard, but like someone waiting for a door to open that should never have closed in the first place. Clark stood behind the one-way glass in the observation room, arms crossed, eyes fixed on both of them. Leo had curled his body against the base of the door, muzzle resting on his paws, gaze unbroken. It had been over an hour. He hadn't moved once. A fellow officer stepped in behind Clark, whispering like they were in a church. "What's going on with him? That's not like Leo." Clark didn't answer right away. His jaw twitched. His voice came out lower than usual. "He disobeyed a command tonight." The officer raised an eyebrow. Leo, you sure? Clark nodded slowly. I gave the attack order. Twice. Silence. Then, what did the guy do? Clark hesitated. Said a name? The other officer scoffed lightly. A name? Leo, Clark said, finally turning toward him. He said Leo's name, and the dog recognized it. There was no response to that, just a long, uneasy pause, the kind of silence that doesn't need filling. Back at his desk, Clark flipped through Leo's intake file again. He'd seen it 100 times, but tonight the words felt like strangers. Stray, male, approx, 2 years old, no chip, no collar. Found near West Residential Zone. No photo. Fast-tracked for training. It had always struck him as efficient. Lucky, even. Now it felt like a lie. He turned back toward the glass. Leo was still there. Julian hadn't said a word. He hadn't asked for a lawyer. He hadn't shouted about being innocent. He just sat. Wet, tired, eyes distant, and every now and then he looked at Leo and smiled, softly, brokenly, like someone who'd lost everything, then found it again, and didn't dare reach for it in case it disappeared. Clark poured himself a cup of coffee. It went cold on the desk beside him. Something wasn't adding up. Dogs don't hesitate on command, especially not canines like Leo, not unless something inside them tells them they shouldn't. And Leo had never done that before. Never. Until tonight. Until that man. Until that name. Clark stared down at the file again, and one sentence burned itself into the front of his mind. Temporarily classified as stray. Temporarily. Why temporary? Why would a stray classification need an expiration date? And why did the man in the holding cell seem less like a suspect and more like someone grieving a home he used to know? He stood, left the cold coffee behind, walked back down the hall. Leo didn't move as he approached. His ears twitched, but his body stayed curled against the metal door like it was the only thing tethering him to the world. Clark crouched beside him, ran a slow hand along his back. Leo didn't pull away, but he didn't look at Clark either. He only looked at Julian. And Julian, sensing something beyond the metal and glass, lifted his head. Their eyes met. Clark wasn't sure whose gaze he felt more deeply, the man behind bars or the dog guarding them. All he knew was that somewhere between duty and doubt, a truth had begun to stir. And there would be no silencing it now. Clark didn't sleep that night, not because of adrenaline, not because of paperwork, but because of something that had settled into the marrow of his bones, slow and thick and impossible to shake. Doubt. He sat in the quiet of the precinct's canine records room, long after the hallway lights dimmed and the coffee pot gave up its final drop. The room smelled of old dust and something else, something older. Paper, memory, forgotten things. He opened Leo's file again. Same cover, same summary, same single line in the upper right corner. K9 ID K917, intake, date 10/2019. The date. Blurred out. Something had scratched over the printed numbers, and in faint pen, another date had been written in the margin. Different ink, different handwriting. Sloppy. Unusual. Clark frowned. In law enforcement, records were precise, clean. Mistakes got people hurt. You didn't scribble over an intake date with a ballpoint pen. He flipped the page. No photo. No found by entry. No vet records. No confirmation from any shelter. Only a vague sentence. Found near West Residential Zone. Healthy, obedient, shows signs of prior basic training. Found by whom? Filed by whom? He turned to the last page. Signature. C. Denton. Clark sat back slowly. The name was familiar, of course. Lieutenant Charles Denton, head of the K-9 unit. A man who had overseen every dog's induction into the program for over a decade. Respected. Stoic. Methodical. And suddenly, present in all the wrong places. Clark pushed the chair back and stood. His legs felt stiff, heavy. He moved through the precinct with quiet purpose, like a man walking into a story he hadn't realized he'd been part of since the beginning. In the data room, Clark searched for missing pet reports filed in Ashford Springs in the summer of 2019. He filtered by address. Nothing. At first. But then one file blinked to life in the archive system. Thin, half-buried. Case type: missing pet. Reporting party: Linda Hayes. Location: 1274 Elmwood Street, Pet. Description: male dog, dark brown coat, white marking behind left ear. Name: Leo. Filed June 19, 2019. Officer assigned: C. Denton. Clark's mouth went dry. Same dog. Same name. Same summer. Same man. His fingers hovered over the keys for a long second, as though pressing enter might change everything. It didn't. The report was short. Almost aggressively so. No follow-up. No investigation notes. Just a sentence at the bottom. No further action required. Pet presumed lost. And 6 weeks later, a fully trained dog named Leo appears in the department's K-9 intake, labeled a stray, adopted by the system. Clark felt a slow, nauseous pressure build in his chest, like discovering a hole beneath a floor he thought was solid. His next stop was the precinct's storage records, specifically the log of temporary K-9 holding contracts from external facilities. Only one had been active in 2019. A short-term agreement with a private contractor, a modest warehouse space listed under a now-defunct training group. Clark went there the next day. The key was old, the lock rusted. The air inside smelled like mothballs and memory. He moved slowly past stacked crates labeled harnesses, training collars, muzzles, until something caught his eye. A box shoved behind an old filing cabinet. It wasn't labeled. Inside were scattered items, worn leashes, faded photos, and a small bundle of dog tags. Metal. Scratched. Real. He picked one up, turned it over in his hand. Leo, 1274 Elmwood. No rank, no K-9 number, just a name. And an address. Julian's address. Clark sat on the cold floor of that dim storage unit with the tag clutched in his palm, listening to the sound of nothing. It echoed louder than sirens. Back at the station, Clark sat with the tag still in his pocket. Outside the holding cell, Leo hadn't moved. Still curled against the door. Still watching. Inside, Julian hadn't slept either. He just stared at the wall, at the dog, at the hours that slipped by without sound. Clark stepped into the room. Julian looked up, slow and tired. Clark pulled the metal tag from his pocket and placed it on the table. Julian stared at it for a long time, then nodded, once. His voice cracked when he spoke. That was his first tag. I had it made when he turned 6 months old. He chewed the first one off his collar, so I had this one engraved myself. He ran a thumb gently across the metal, like it was holy. Clark didn't interrupt, not now. Julian went on. He used to sleep right at my feet every night. He wasn't the fastest learner, but he remembered everything. Every little thing. And he always knew when something was wrong. He smiled, faintly. We had this game. When I'd say, "Big bro," he'd put his paw in my hand like he was greeting me. Dumb little trick. But he loved it. We both did. Clark's chest tightened. He thought about Leo's training records, how the dog had learned at record speed, how his obedience was immediate, uncanny. Not because he was a blank slate, because he had already lived a whole life before the department ever claimed him. A life with a name, a backyard, a boy who called him brother. Clark stepped out of the room. He didn't speak for a long time. Didn't write his report, didn't file the tag. He simply walked back to the cell. And for the first time, he didn't see a suspect. He saw a memory waiting to be restored. And a dog, guarding not a prisoner, but a piece of himself he hadn't seen in 6 long years. By morning, the rain had stopped, but the storm hadn't passed. The clouds still hung low over Ashford Springs, casting long shadows across the precinct floor as Officer Raymond Clark walked slowly through the main corridor, every step echoing like a question he didn't yet know how to answer. He passed by the holding cell again. Leo hadn't moved. His body was still curled tight against the door. Not sleeping. Just waiting. Like something unfinished had tethered him there. Inside, Julian Hayes sat upright now, elbows on his knees, eyes clear but far away. He didn't look like someone afraid. He looked like someone trying to believe this wasn't just a dream finally ending. Clark moved past without speaking. But something deep in his chest stirred. A quiet urgency pressing inward like a tide. He had questions. But more than that, he had a responsibility now. In the records room, Clark began pulling K9 files. Every intake from the past 6 years marked as stray, lost, or owner surrender. He built a stack as thick as his doubts. One by one, he sifted through them, laying the files side by side on the long table under flickering fluorescent light. The patterns weren't obvious at first, but then the details began to whisper. 5 of the files had intake dates scratched out and rewritten by hand. 4 had no found by entry. 2 had vet check forms completely missing. And all 8? Signed by Lieutenant Charles Denton. Clark stared at the pages as if they'd betrayed him. For a long time, Denton had been a figure of unshakable trust, commanding, composed, the kind of man who believed order was more than a principle. It was gospel. And yet here he was, his signature appearing in the quiet margins of every file that felt wrong. Clark stood, ran a hand through his hair, then reached for his phone. He made one call. "I need access to Denton's duty logs, and do we still have the surveillance footage from the alley behind the Ashford Market?" The answer came an hour later. The footage was grainy, standard municipal camera feed, but it was enough. At 9:42 p.m., just 10 minutes before the silent alarm triggered, a dark pickup truck had pulled into the alley behind the store. The license plate, barely legible, was caught in one infrared frame. Clark paused the video, then slowly, quietly, pulled up the DMV record. Registered owner, Charles Denton. There was no call log from Denton on the break-in. No reason for him to be there. No assignment placing him anywhere near Ashford Market that night. So why had he shown up? Why leave before the squad car arrived? Clark stared at the screen. The dots were beginning to form a line, and it was pointing straight at the man who'd signed Leo into service and possibly stolen a dog from a boy's backyard. He didn't wait. That afternoon, Clark walked into Denton's office. The door was open, barely. The smell inside was old coffee and colder authority. Denton sat behind his desk, filing something slowly, deliberately. He looked up when Clark entered. "Something on your mind?" Clark dropped a folder onto the desk. Printed reports, file scans, a still shot from the surveillance video, and a small, clear bag holding Leo's original dog tag. Denton didn't flinch, but his eyes stopped moving. "You knew," Clark said quietly. "You signed every file," he added, voice still calm but heavier now. "You filed Julian's missing pet report. 6 weeks later, you processed the same dog into the canine unit as a stray. No vet report, no shelter paperwork, no intake photo, just your signature." Denton leaned back in his chair. "You don't understand the whole picture," he said. The words were slow, even, coated in control. Clark didn't blink. "Then explain it to me, because all I see is a lie wrapped in a badge." Denton's eyes narrowed. "You're playing with things that don't concern you, son." Clark leaned in just slightly. "That dog is not a stray. He had a home. He had a boy. You didn't rescue him. You erased him." There was a silence then. Not loud, but dangerous. Denton didn't shout. He didn't deny. He just said, "Be careful, Raymond. You're digging the kind of grave that swallows more than just pride." Clark didn't respond. He didn't need to. The dog tag between them already spoke loud enough. Hours later, Clark was finishing a report when the sound of heavy boots hit the floor like thunder. Denton. Storming. Angry. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he barked, slamming a folder down on the desk. "You interrogated your superior officer. You accessed sealed files. You broke into a storage unit you had no clearance for. All for a dog." Clark stood slowly. "No," he said, "not for a dog. For the truth." Denton's face twisted. Rage, disbelief, something darker. "You're risking your career over a mutt that belonged to some nobody." That was when it happened. The moment that burned itself into the walls of the precinct. Denton marched toward the holding cell, toward Julian, toward Leo. And Leo, silent until now, rose from the floor like a storm being born. No bark, no growl. But his body tensed, blocking the path. Eyes locked, fixed, sharp. He didn't need words. He was saying, "Not this time." Denton froze mid-step. The silence was louder than any alarm. Behind them, a new security camera, installed just weeks ago, captured every frame. Clark didn't move. He didn't need to. Leo had already made the decision. Later that night, Clark sat with Edith Morgan in the conference room. She had returned, holding a weathered envelope in her hands. Inside was a photograph, taken from her window 6 years ago. A man in a uniform dragging a dog, struggling through the side gate of 1274 Elmwood. Denton. And the dog? Leo. Clear as memory. Frame by frame, the past had finally walked out of the shadows. And in Clark's mind, one truth had solidified like stone. This wasn't just a cover-up. It was a theft of something sacred. A home. A bond. A life. And Leo, he had never forgotten. The photograph changed everything. In the harsh lighting of the conference room, the image looked older than it should have, faded at the edges, printed on matte paper with a slightly yellow tint. But what it showed was sharp. Undeniable. Charles Denton, in uniform, opening a side gate at 1274 Elmwood, a leash pulled tight in one hand, and the dog, ears flat, legs braced, eyes wide. Leo. The silhouette of a woman, Julian's mother, framed in the window behind them, hand pressed against the glass as if she were too late. Clark stared at it for a long time before he looked up at Edith. Her eyes didn't waver. They didn't need to. "I saw it all," she said. "I just didn't know what I was seeing until now." Clark nodded once, tightly. "You saw the truth." She folded the photo back into the envelope and whispered, almost to herself, "Took 6 years, but maybe it's time it was seen." The next morning, the mood at Ashford Springs Police Department was unlike anything Clark had felt before. Tense, exposed, as if every hallway had begun holding its breath. Word of the photograph, quiet at first, was beginning to ripple. And with it came something Clark hadn't expected. Silence. Not dismissal. Not denial. Just the heavy hush of people who had seen the same pattern he had, and never thought to question it until now. Clark walked into the captain's office at noon, his report and evidence in hand. Leo's original tag, the tampered records, the photo, and a full timeline. He spoke without needing to raise his voice, without anger. Just clarity. "This isn't about a dog," he said. "It's about what we allowed to happen because we trusted a badge more than the truth." The captain said nothing at first. Then quietly, he reached for the folder. By mid-afternoon, the suspension order was signed. Charles Denton, lieutenant founder of the K-9 unit, 22 years in the department, was called into the briefing room. He didn't speak, didn't argue, just stood while his badge, sidearm, and keycard were removed. He looked at Clark once, not with rage this time, not even with guilt, just a look that said, "You really did it." Clark held that stare without blinking. So did Leo, standing behind him. No leash, no handler, no command. Just present. Tall. Watchful. Like justice had finally found its voice in the one creature no one expected to speak. Outside, the sky was gray but dry. Inside the holding cell, Julian sat on the bench, hands in his lap, gaze soft but alert. He stood when Clark entered. "I heard," he said. Clark nodded. "It's done." Julian hesitated, then asked, "What happens to Leo now?" Clark stepped aside. The door opened. Leo walked in, slow, cautious, eyes locked on Julian as if scanning him not for threats, but for pieces of the boy he used to know. Julian knelt. He didn't speak, just raised his hand. Leo moved forward. 1 step. 2. Then he lifted his paw, placed it into Julian's palm. "Big bro." The room didn't move. Clark turned away, partly out of respect, partly because something in his chest had cracked open, and he wasn't ready for anyone to see it that evening. As the sun slipped below the rooftops of Ashford Springs, a small, closed-door meeting took place between the chief, the legal team, Julian, and Clark. Clark laid out the full story, step by step. Julian didn't demand anything. He simply said, "I don't want to take him away. He's not just mine anymore. He's part of something bigger now." There was a pause, a deep, thoughtful one. Then the chief cleared his throat. "What do you propose?" Julian looked toward Clark, then to Leo, curled beside the door like he'd always been there. "We share him." A few eyebrows lifted. 1 week on duty, 1 week home. Let him serve, but also let him rest where he remembers who he used to be. It wasn't just a compromise. It was a homecoming, rewritten with dignity. The decision was signed the next day. Leo, once stolen, then molded into a tool, was now something neither side had ever imagined. A hero who belonged to 2 worlds. The police department would cover his training and medical care. Julian would provide his home. And together, they would keep him balanced, between service and soul. News spread fast. A photo of Leo sitting between Julian and Clark at the station went viral. One man in uniform, the other in jeans, both smiling with a dog between them that had once been lost to both. The caption read, "2 names, 1 heart." But that night, away from screens and headlines, something simpler happened. Clark stood in Julian's backyard, arms folded, watching as Leo chased a ball through the grass. Ears perked, tail high, tongue lolling sideways in the fading light. Julian laughed softly and knelt to greet him. Leo trotted back, dropped the ball, and sat down with a satisfied huff. Clark smiled. And for the first time in a long while, the silence between them wasn't heavy. It was peace. It was belonging. It was the sound of something sacred being returned. Not with sirens, not with apologies, but with time and love. The next morning, the phones at Ashford Springs PD rang like a church bell on fire. Voicemails poured in. Emails stacked faster than they could be read. Everyone wanted the story. From state reporters to national morning shows, from animal rights organizations to former law enforcement officers with stories of their own. The case had struck something raw, something buried beneath layers of uniform and authority. A stolen bond, a voiceless victim, and a dog who remembered everything. Raymond Clark didn't care much for the spotlight, but he read every message that came through. One came from a retired officer in North Carolina who had lost his own canine in a custody battle after retirement. Another from a child in Montana. "Leo is a hero. I wish he could be my dog." And then one, handwritten, mailed, from a woman in Oregon who had her therapy dog taken by her ex during a divorce. The last line read, "Sometimes people steal animals, but it's the memories they can't erase." Clark kept that one, tucked it in his desk drawer, folded neatly. But not everyone was celebrating. The fallout came slowly, then all at once. Internal Affairs reopened all canine files processed by Denton over the last decade. Dozens of them, some with irregularities, a few with silent flags that had been overlooked or buried, and in 5 of those cases, the dogs had originally been reported missing, stolen. The findings shocked the department and shattered it. Denton's legacy, once held up as a model, now unraveled thread by thread under the weight of betrayal. The district attorney filed charges: abuse of authority, falsification of public records, unlawful seizure of personal property. He was suspended indefinitely, pending trial. His silence during questioning only deepened the shadows he left behind. Through it all, Leo never changed. He didn't ask for justice. He didn't react to headlines. He didn't know what words like felony or suspension meant. He only knew when he was safe, and where home was. Back at Julian's house, the backyard had become a rhythm of something beautiful. Simple games, long naps, and moments that felt like rewound childhood. On Leo's first week off duty, he followed Julian from room to room like a quiet shadow, rediscovering every scent, every creaky floorboard. Sometimes he would pause by the back door, paw resting against the glass like he was waiting to be let into a memory. Julian always opened it, and every time, Leo stepped outside like it was the first time. Tail high, ears alert, home. Clark visited often, not in uniform, just as himself. He would sit on the old stone bench under the elm tree, sipping coffee that always went cold in his hand, watching Leo move through the yard like a story being rewritten with every step. Sometimes Julian would sit beside him. They didn't talk much, but when they did, the words were soft, measured. "I used to think I imagined it," Julian said once, staring at Leo napping in a patch of golden sun. "Like maybe I made him up, or maybe he left because I wasn't good enough to keep him." Clark shook his head. He never left. He was taken. Julian looked down at his hands, then whispered, "But he remembered me. After all this time, he still remembered." Clark's voice was quiet. "That's not memory, that's love." One afternoon, Leo's rotation was due. The department van pulled up. Uniformed handlers approached with careful steps. Julian crouched in front of Leo and clipped on the canine vest. The vest that said, "Police, Ashford Springs," across the back. His fingers lingered on the straps a little longer than they needed to. Leo stood still, proud. But his eyes kept flicking back to Julian, like asking, "Is it okay?" Julian smiled, even though his throat was tightening. "It's okay, buddy. Go do your job." Leo nuzzled against his arm, then trotted off with the handlers, his stride steady, head high. Julian watched until the van turned the corner. Then he sat down on the porch steps. Didn't cry, didn't move, just breathed. The silence was different now, not empty, just full of everything he'd finally found again, and let go of, willingly, because he knew Leo wasn't lost anymore. Later that night, as the department shift changed, Leo returned from duty. The officers reported he'd performed flawlessly. Search and rescue drills, scent tracking, response to voice and hand signals. But the moment the van pulled up in front of Julian's house, the dog didn't wait for a command. He leapt from the vehicle, bolted through the open gate, and sprinted into the backyard. Julian stepped outside. No words, just open arms. Leo barreled into him like no time had passed, and in that moment, the cycle was complete. Service, return, home. That night, Clark stood across the street, watching from a distance. He wasn't needed there. Not anymore. But he stayed a while, hands in his coat pockets, heart quieter than it had been in years. Above him, the sky began to break. Clouds parting for the first time in days, letting in a sliver of moonlight. It fell across the house, the yard, and the shape of a dog curled at a boy's feet. And in that soft silver glow, Clark knew. Justice hadn't come with a gavel or a badge. It came on 4 legs, and it remembered. Days became weeks. The town moved forward, slowly, its rhythms returning to something like normal. But normal had changed. People no longer saw Leo as just a dog in a vest. They saw a soul in uniform, a survivor, a sentinel of something deeper. At the station, officers paused when he passed, not out of fear, not even out of reverence, out of respect. Leo was no longer just a canine. He was a reminder of truth, of loyalty, of what happens when someone refuses to forget. Julian kept the back gate unlocked now. Every time Leo returned from duty, he never waited at the door. He just walked in, as if he'd never left, as if he was never supposed to. Sometimes Julian would find him curled in the corner of the living room, beside the old chair where he used to sleep as a puppy. Other times, he'd be outside chasing birds from the fence like he'd done when he was young. There were no commands needed. He just knew where to go, because home was never trained into him. It was remembered. On one of those soft spring mornings, Clark visited again. He brought Leo's new certificate with him, officially recognizing Leo as a dual-purpose canine with special residential rights. It was signed by the chief, the city attorney, and the department's veterinary specialist. At the bottom, written in blue ink with a shaking hand, was Julian's signature. Clark handed it over. Julian didn't say much, just nodded, his fingers brushing the embossed seal like it was something fragile and alive. "Means he belongs here too," Clark said quietly. Julian looked down at Leo, dozing in the shade, one ear twitching. "He always did." The media attention faded eventually. The stories stopped trending. The hashtags quieted. The comments slowed. But in Ashford Springs, Leo's legacy didn't vanish. It deepened. At the station, a framed photo now hung near the K-9 unit's entrance. Leo, between Julian and Clark, taken on the day of his reinstatement. Below it was a quote: "Some loyalty is trained, some is earned, but the strongest kind is remembered." The officers called it the Wall of Heart. New recruits were told the story on their first day, not as a warning, as a lesson about what matters, about who matters. A year later, on the anniversary of the night it all began, Ashford Springs hosted a small outdoor ceremony. Nothing grand. No parade, just a backyard gathering with neighbors, a few officers, Edith Morgan seated proudly near the fence, and Leo, wearing a vest that now read, "K-9 Officer, Homebound Unit." Julian stood at the porch, a small note in his hand. He cleared his throat but didn't read from the page. He didn't need to. He just looked at Leo and said, "Thank you for remembering me. I never stopped waiting." Leo stood and walked to him, slow, deliberate. Then he sat and lifted his paw. Julian took it. Big bro. As the sun dipped low behind the treetops, Clark stood by the edge of the yard, sipping cold coffee again, smiling softly. He didn't feel like an officer in that moment. He felt like a witness. To love. To justice. To the quiet power of memory that refused to die. And as he watched Leo settle beside Julian under the golden light, Clark thought, "This isn't the ending. It's the beginning of what was always meant to be." If Leo's story touched your heart, if you've ever loved a dog like family, if you believe that loyalty doesn't need training, and that some bonds outlast even time, then this story was for you. Leave a comment below. Some loyalty is remembered. Share this video with someone who needs hope. Subscribe to Dog Stories for more true, emotional tales of courage, reunion, and the invisible threads that connect us. We read every message. Every memory you share matters. And who knows? The next story might be yours. Until next time, stay kind, stay true, and never stop believing in the ones who wait.